Hello, my name is Samuel Crowfoot. I'm on council for Siksika. It's my second term, and I have been tasked by Chief and Council to be the main push behind creating some of the nation's bylaws. Historically, we have not had many enforceable bylaws on Siksika. In fact, our first bylaw goes back to 1956, I think is a noxious weeds bylaw. And we've had a series of bylaws on our books since that time. Since that time, about 67-ish years or so, we have never had our bylaws enforceable until recently, where we created a prosecutor's office and where we've been able to reach certain agreements with the RCMP and meet some of their requirements to have our bylaws enforced. As part of that process in identifying where and how our bylaws can be enforced, we've also seen where our bylaws need to fill in gaps in services. One of those that was pretty clear evident on when I first returned back home to Siksika in January 2020 is in the area of elder and vulnerable people protection. Sometimes when things happen and the RCMP are involved or they're called upon, they are not able to act because the behavior in question that necessitated them to respond to an incident in the first place did not rise to the level of criminal activity. So a case would be, maybe a grandma has one of her grandchildren upset and they're kind of upset and yelling or acting kind of intimidating, a behavior that could be considered abusive, disrespectful, but not necessarily criminal, where the RCMP would become involved. We want to make sure that our elders are protected and that our vulnerable people are protected, not just against criminal activity, which applies to everybody, but also in other situations that are more befitting for the culture and tradition of Siksika, more befitting and respectful for the elders, so that they don't have to necessarily feel intimidated or be in fear as a result of their advanced age. And so what we decided to do as council was to bring forth a bylaw that was able to protect our people in a civil sense, not a criminal sense, but in a civil sense, in a civil matter, to make sure that they're protected and respected and treated appropriately, right? Everybody knows that we have to protect our elders, and every day we have less and less. That's just how it is. So this bylaw was originally set to make sure that people can be protected. Once the bylaw is fully in effect, which would be a little ways still. Once the bylaw is fully in effect, it's presumed, anticipated, and planned that if a situation happens where someone reports an infraction of the bylaw, either something they've seen or witnessed or have knowledge of, that referral would be sent then to either the police officers, RCMP and or our own nation's police officers or our peace officers. And a referral would then be made to the bylaw prosecutor. The bylaw prosecutor then would review the file and determine what the best course of action is, either to continue with the charges in the complaint or to dismiss, as they have that discretion. And that prosecutorial power is the same no matter what level of government you're at, either province or municipal governments, nation governments. The prosecutors have that discretion. In the event that a case is continued, that would then be referred to alternative dispute resolution, which for Siksika has been historically our escapemikix service. So what this bylaw means is that it's going to involve not just the prosecutor or the police or whoever may take that report and forward that on to the prosecutors. It's also going to involve our own people with our own ways and traditions of handling things. And it is meant to more correct and instruct and to restore than rather for it to be punitive. And so that's really where we started out with the bylaw. We couldn't really put a bylaw in place, though, like I said, if it's unenforceable. And as I mentioned, there are key positions that have not been in place ever in Canada for a First Nation, to my knowledge. Very few nations have been able to have their own tribal bylaws enforced in court, provincial court, for a lot of reasons, most of which, who is going to represent the government that issued that bylaw, in our case Siksika, who's going to represent Siksika in court to make sure that the bylaws are respected. So that's really the history of the bylaw and why it's come to pass, and where we are, why we are where we are. And so I mentioned briefly that in our bylaw passing and our bylaw creation, right now it's open up for public comment. So we've done, I believe, 3, actually I think it's been more than 3, if I remember correctly, requisite readings, or pre-readings rather, just to review the bylaw to make sure it's in an acceptable format and to make sure that the contents explained therein are applicable and relevant to what we're trying to do here on Siksika. We then, after going through that legislative process, and Chief and Council is the legislative body of Siksika, once we have gone through that legislative process, we then released that bylaw for public comment, for people to review and to give us their comments and suggestions, because it's a firm belief of mine and everybody else on Chief and Council that the people should have a say in what bylaws are enforced and what bylaws should be presented and what bylaws should be legislated. To date, I have not received any complaints, any comments or suggestions about the bylaw from a lot of people. Just from a few people have sent some things in to me as indicated in our public notice. But that's okay. I understand that sometimes when you're talking about a bylaw and some of the language contained therein can be a little bit confusing or downright foreign to people who might not be familiar with that language, particularly the elders, many of which Blackfoot is their first language. And so to make sure there's nothing lost in translation, Chief and Council, once the public comment has ended, will then be holding community consultation groups, smaller groups, with different people on the reserve, different groups of elders, to present the bylaw to them, what it means, and to take their comments and suggestions, and then incorporate that into the bylaw when and where appropriate. Once we've reached that public consultation and once the elders have had a chance to weigh in and have the bylaw explain to them what it seeks to do and how these cases will be handled, we'll then look to pass, right? There is a need for it, but we want to make sure we do things the right way and not necessarily the quick way, right? Now, sometimes those are one and the same, but in this case, we want to make sure that we do it correctly and we do it properly. So that's one of the bylaws that we have coming before the nation.